Hi everyone, I'm Freddie and I read 12 books in February. In this video, I'll give my thoughts on all the books I read and also my thoughts on the 2 DNFs that I had in February and why. But first, let's go over some statistics on the books I read. First off, 6 of them were physical books and 6 of them were audiobooks. So it was half and half, and actually my DNFs were also one of each. So I spread it out, no ebooks this month, but I read 3,467 pages this month, and I listened to a bit more than 53 hours of audiobooks. When looking at moods, most were the adventurous mood, and for the most part, the books I read were medium paced. This month, I read long physical books and listened to short audiobooks. Overall, for the most part, most of my reads were fantasy, which does not surprise me at all, and all of the books were in English this month. So I failed on my reading Danish books this month. I'll try and do better in March. And the average rating I gave this month was 4.09 stars. So not a bad reading month. That was all for this month's stats. So let's just get right into the books I read. So I'm going to start with the books that I read physically, and I'm going to start by mentioning the one DNF I had that was a physical book, and that was The Water Knife by Paolo Bacigalupi. I got about 100 pages into this book when I DNF'd it, which is about a quarter of the way. This is a dystopian sci-fi thriller set in a future where water has become a very scarce resource and everyone's kind of fighting over it. And in it, there are 3 characters we follow. One who works for a big shot who's controlling the supply of water to a large area, a journalist who is looking into a murder, and a young woman who's basically just trying to survive without having any means. So as I mentioned, I DNF'd this book. I don't think it's the fault of the book necessarily. I didn't realize it was a thriller when I first bought it. I very rarely read thrillers because I don't find them thrilling. So I don't think it's this book's fault necessarily. It was just not the book for me. After reading about 100 pages, I wasn't particularly interested in the characters or in the mystery or anything like that. So I just figured I'm not gonna get hooked if I'm not already hooked 100 pages in. So I just figured it was my lack of interest in thrillers that made me DNF this book. That doesn't mean it won't work for you if you think it sounds interesting and you're more prone to reading thrillers than me. I just very rarely find them interesting for me. So that was my one physical book DNF. Now let's get into the physical books I actually read this month. And we'll start with 3 books in a series where I have vlogs of me reading all 3 books. And that would be the first 3 books in the Wheel of Time series. And we're going to go one by one. I wanted to hold them up. Immediately regretted my decision. It's fine. First off, we have The Eye of the World, the first in the series. This is, of course, a very well-known series by Robert Jordan, and it is an epic fantasy series. And in it, we follow Rand al'Thor, who has grown up on a farm with his father in a remote village where they don't really hear much about the world around them, what's going on. And when the village is suddenly attacked, he and some of his friends end up having to flee the village for the safety of everyone else, and they go on a long journey and a long adventure. And it's hard to say much more about the plot without spoiling it. They go along with magic user Moraine and Lan, who is a sword-wielding warder, it's called, who are basically sworn to protect the Aes Sedai, who are the magic users. I gave this 4 stars. I really liked it. I thought it was a good opening for a series. It was quite slow-paced until like the last 200 pages, and suddenly it picked up. I really enjoyed the cast of characters. Now in this first novel, it's mostly from Rand's POV, though there are some POV switches, but at least in the books I read so far, it does open up a bit more to multi-POV, so I expect that to continue. But I really enjoyed this first book. I felt like it gave me a lot of questions, opened a lot of potential threads for later books, while still also being a relatively self-contained story. But given that I have a blog, if you want more in-depth thoughts, they are spoiler-free vlogs, so if you're interested, check that out to hear more on my thoughts on this book. Now the second book I gave 5 stars. This did not have any of the slow pace parts that the first one kind of fell into. This gripped me from the beginning and just ran straight through. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It is a bit shorter than the first one, but I was hooked from the beginning all the way to the end. I really liked how the characters were developing, how the plot was progressing, how we were learning more about the world and the magic system. And I will say I was quite surprised by some of the plot points, like how fast they were progressing, because given that it's such a long series, there were things happening already in the second book that I expected to happen like 10 books in or something, which just made me even more excited to read the rest of the series, because then, you know, new plot threads are going to have to come up and new things will be happening. So thoroughly enjoyed this book. So far, my favorite in the series. I've only read 3 out of 14, so it's not saying much. But for now, it holds the top spot. And then we have the third book, The Dragon Reborn. This I gave 4 stars. I did enjoy it. I just didn't feel like it was hooking me in the same way that the second one did. There were some interesting POV choices, I think, that were quite different from what I expected and from the 2 previous books. And I feel like this is definitely setting up a lot of things for the series going forward, but there were parts of the plot structure that I felt were becoming a little bit predictable. So that's also part of the reason why I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I did the second one, but I still really enjoyed it. So it's still a 4-star, but it did not topple The Great Hunt as my favorite of the series so far. Now, as I mentioned, I do have vlogs of me reading each of these books that I will link down below. If you're interested in that, those are spoiler free. I'm also working on a spoiler full video of my thoughts on the first 3 books, and I will soon be starting on the 4th book. So keep an eye out if you're interested in any of that. Next up, we have a book that was a reread for me this month, and that would be Warm Bodies by Isaac Marion. I read the prequel to this in January, so I wanted to reread this before moving on to the sequel. This is a YA zombie romance that was made into a movie more than a decade ago, I believe. In it, we follow R, who has forgotten his name since he became a zombie. He lives in a broken down airport, and his life is kind of boring until he and his zombie buddies go into the city to look for food, and he encounters Julie, who he kind of kidnaps and brings back with him to the airport after eating the brains of her boyfriend and gaining some memories through that. And for some reason, R seems to be changing a bit. Now, as I mentioned, this was a reread for me. I first read it 12 or 13 years ago before the movie came out. I remember seeing it on the shelf. The cover was facing out, and I really liked this cover, and that's why I bought it, and I loved it when I read it. So it was a 5-star book then. I still gave it 5-star on this reread. I can't say if it's nostalgia reasons or what. I love this book. I think it's great. I think R and Julie, and yes, that is a Romeo and Juliet reference, I think they're very interesting and endearing characters, especially R. I think he's very endearing. And I enjoyed reading about them getting to know each other again. And there were also a lot of details that I had forgotten because it's been a while since I last read it. And it's been just as long since I saw the movie, which doesn't completely follow the book, as no adaptation ever does. It is a very enjoyable movie, and I still liked it back when it came out. I just don't remember much now. And I also think that the zombies that Isaac Marion has created are quite fascinating and interesting. And I look forward to continuing on with, I think there are 2 more books that he wrote afterwards, and I have one of them. So I'm looking forward to starting on that. Next up, we move into a couple of young adult contemporary novels that I read, both by the same author, both coming of age stories that I found quite relatable. First, we have Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. Now, you might know Alice Oseman for Heartstopper, either the TV show or the graphic novel. I've been a fan of the graphic novels for quite a while, and I really enjoyed the TV show as well. I need to watch the latest season, so no spoilers. And this is set in the same universe as Heartstopper. In it, we follow Frances, who is known to be a high-achieving student who is headed for a great university. At least that's what she's known for at school, but she's very different at home. So she kind of has these 2 very different sides that she shows to the world. At home, she's a bit of a fandom nerd, and she's in particular a big fan of a podcast called Radio Silence. And when she becomes friends with the creator of the podcast, Aled, I honestly have no idea how to pronounce that. I'm going to go with Aled. It is the first time that she experiences real friendship with someone who actually shares some interest, who enjoys the same things, who gets to know the real her, and where she's allowed to be herself more than she normally is. Though, of course, everything isn't just sunshine and roses throughout the whole book. Can't have that. This was a clear 5-star read for me. This book hit me so hard. The exploration of societal expectation and the duality between what you show to the outside world and what you actually feel and how you are inside, and the impact of finding friends who get you on a deep level, which allows you to be yourself more, was just incredibly touching and very relatable to me. I especially loved this centered on the importance of friendship in the formative years for the development of yourself and self-confidence and feeling of self-worth and all of these kinds of things. Because I feel like stories often default a bit to the importance of a romantic connection, and that there's nothing wrong with that. That is very important for lots of people, but this was much more relatable to me, the importance of friendships for the development of self, and it kind of felt like a bit of a breath of fresh air. I don't know that I've read many other books that focus so much on that. And that's not to say that there's no romance at all in this book, but it's definitely on the back burner because the focus is definitely on the friendship between Francis, who is bisexual, and Aled, who is asexual, and I absolutely loved it. And when I was reading it, it felt very clear to me that Alice Oseman really understands the perspective of the characters she's writing here, and it's just an incredibly touching read overall. I read it basically in one sitting, cried many times. I just couldn't put it down. It was just incredibly relatable to me, and I felt very well written. Like the characters were very deep and I feel realistic. I just 5-star. This is a book that I will be thinking about in the future when I'm thinking. Doesn't make any sense, but highly recommend. As I mentioned, I read 2 books by the same author because I also read Loveless by Alice Oseman. Again, a lot of similar themes, young adult, contemporary, coming of age story. But here we follow Georgia, who is heading off to college, never having been kissed or having had any romantic experience. And she's worried that she's falling behind her peers, that there's something wrong with her, and she can't figure out why none of her attempts at romantic connection or anything have worked out. This leads her on a journey of exploring her sexuality and figuring out who she is and really getting to know herself. Now, this was a 4-star read for me. I also felt it was incredibly relatable. Georgia's experience of self-discovery, incredibly relatable to me, to the point that it was a bit eerie at times how relatable it was. I did also enjoy the supporting characters in this one, but I will say it didn't hit me as hard as Radio Silence, which is definitely the one that's going to be sticking with me for the long term. On top of that, there was one plot point that really bugged me, and it's gonna be mild spoilers, but I'm gonna try and be as vague as possible. So in this book, Georgia does some things that make 2 separate people mad at her. One of them I felt was completely warranted. Their reaction I felt made sense with what she'd done. The other one I felt was super overreacting, and I did not feel like it was fair or warranted how they reacted. And that just irritated me as I was reading it because I did not feel like it was fair. And this did lower my enjoyment a bit because it frustrated me and I felt like it was unfair treatment of our main character. So that's why this ended up being a 4-star read and not a 5-star, but I do still feel like this was a very good book. I just had some minor things where I was a little bit annoyed with it. So that was all of the physical books I read this month. So now we're going to go into the audiobooks. As I mentioned, I do have one audiobook, DNF as well, but I'll mention that a bit later because it was the next one in a series where I read a previous book as well. First off, I read Swordcrossed by Freya Marsk. This is a fantasy LGBT plus romance following Maddie, who needs a duelist to stand in as his best man for his wedding because he knows that someone is going to be challenging for the hand of his bride. And this is a wedding that's only happening because his family is in money troubles. And then we have Luca, who is new to the city and recently started hiring out as a duelist. Maddie hires Luca to both be his best man and also give him sword fighting lessons, during which a mutual attraction becomes quite obvious and the sexual tension starts building. And at the same time, we have something that seems very fishy going on with the family business. This book I gave 4 stars. I really enjoyed Maddie and Luca, and I found their building romance quite entertaining. As the reader, you don't know a lot about Luca's background, and you get kind of hints dropped throughout, but I didn't pick up on enough to figure out the reveal before it came, so that's always nice. I did also really enjoy the business intrigue, political intrigue plot, which I feel like is always hit and miss when it's a romance-focused fantasy, but I did find it really interesting as well. So all in all, I really enjoyed this book. I am interested in reading some other works of Freya Marsk, so I might get into that in the coming month. Next up, we have A World Without Princes by Soman Chainani. Now, this is the second book in the School for Good and Evil series, which is a middle grade fantasy series that is heavily fairy tale inspired. So in order not to spoil anything, I'll just go into a bit of what the first book is about. We follow Sophie and Agatha, who come from a village bordering the woods, and they're used to kids being kidnapped every once in a while to go to this school for good and evil. Sophie really wants to go. Agatha does not, but Sophie wants her to be the villain in her story. They do both end up being snatched up and taken to the school, but things don't go quite as they expected. And then in the second book, we pick up where we left off in the first book, and things that we thought might have been handled already in the first book are now no longer handled. Let's say it like that, without giving too much away. This I gave 3 stars. I felt it started great. I flew through the first half. I, of course, listened to it. It was quite interesting to see where we were after the first book and how things had changed because of what happened in the first book. But then it kind of started to drag for me. There was a lot of focus on the friendship between Sophie and Agatha. I feel like they regressed and started fighting over a boy again, and just like in the first book, Sophie annoyed me so much and I liked Agatha, and then in this one they both ended up annoying me. Sophie did grow on me a bit. She didn't annoy me as much as in the first one, but I also don't feel like I was feeling as much empathy as I probably was supposed to. And then Agatha just kind of rubbed me the wrong way in this one. That's why it lowered my enjoyment overall. There were also, I had a similar complaint in the first book, but some traits were quite characterized and over the top in a way where, yeah, I know this is fairy tale inspired, but even fairy tales don't necessarily do it so black and white. So that also kind of bugged me. I did find the ending quite interesting, and I still wanted to move on to the third book. I feel I was left at a place where I was like, didn't really know what would happen in the third book, and I was interested enough that I figured I'll give it a shot. Which brings us to my one audiobook DNF of the month, which was The Last Ever After by Suman Chanani. This is the third book. Now there are several trilogies in the series, but this is like the ending to the original trilogy. And I got about 5 hours in, which is a quarter of the book. And when I got about a quarter in, I just realized I had lost all interest in what was happening. I feel like we kept having the characters go back and forth, regressing, progressing, then go back. It's just like any development we were seeing was being reversed and then unreversed and then back. And the problems I had with the characters were no longer outweighed by my interest in the plot. That was also disappearing. So I decided to give it up as not for me and return it to the library. Next, we have some audiobooks in a series where I read 3 of them this month, or I listened to 3 of them this month. The first being Where the Drowned Girls Go by Shannon Maguire. This is the 7th novella in the Wayward Children series, which as a series is basically a bunch of different portal fantasies. In some of the books, we follow children going into or going through their doors into their various portal worlds. Some are very whimsical, fairy tale like, some are very dark and not fun to go to. And then in some of the novellas, we follow the kids who have returned from their doors and they're going to this school where they're being kind of rehabilitated, but at the same time, a lot of them wishing or hoping for their doors to come back so they can go back to this portal world that they went to. And in this one, we follow a character that we've met before who has been kind of traumatized in a different world from her own, and she wants to forget everything that happens in order to reintegrate into the normal world. And in order to do that, she gets sent to a different school than the other kids, a school that's trying to make the kids forget that anything happened and make them basically gaslight them to think that nothing that they think is real about the portal world is actually real, and it's just things that they made up, so that they can convince them that the real world is the only world. I gave this one 3 stars because while it was interesting to kind of see a different side to it when it comes to kids coming back from these portal fantasy worlds and how they might be trying to cope with whatever happened to them, I don't really feel like all that much happened in this story. And honestly, all of these novellas are around like 180 to 200 pages. And if you can't keep me interested and engaged for that amount of pages, then I feel like there's something wrong. The main character we follow in this one, I think is fine. It's not that I had anything against her. There were some quite interesting points about how weight and overweight is perceived and kind of prejudices against people who are overweight and assumptions that people make. And that's basically all I took away from this book, I feel, because for the rest of it, I didn't really feel like there was that much happening. Now, the next one, which is Lost in the Moment and Found, which is the 8th one, I enjoyed a lot more. This book has several trigger warnings, and they were mentioned at the beginning of the book, so definitely I recommend looking those up if you know that you're sensitive to triggers. In this one, we follow Antoinette, or Ancy as she's called, who in the opening of the book loses her father when she's quite young, and things in her home situation afterwards end up making her run away, finding a door, and this door leads to the shop where lost things go. Since it's such a short book, it's kind of hard to say much more without spoiling anything. Now, I gave this book 4 stars. I was waffling between 4 or 5 stars, so if I ever start giving half or quarter ratings, it would probably be somewhere in between, because for one, it dealt with some very serious topics in a very respectful and compassionate way. It starts right off the bat with like an emotional gut punch, and it keeps being quite emotional throughout. I quite liked Ancy, and I found her perspective on things quite interesting, especially as a child in a situation where you don't really know what's going on, but you know that something's not right. And honestly, this could have been quite a bit longer, and I would not have minded. At the end of this book, I was left with the feeling of hoping that we would see more of Ancy and more of her story after the conclusion of this one. I'm still honestly not sure about my rating, but for now I'm going to leave it at 4 stars because I did have some things that I didn't love about it, but it definitely made me emotional. Now this brings us to the last of the Wayward Children books that I read this month, which is Mislaid in Parts Unknown. Nope. Mislaid in Parts Half Known. And it's going to be hard not to spoil anything with this one, but it follows right after the last one where it left off. Now we're back in the school following someone kind of adjusting to the world again. I gave this one 4 stars as well. It wasn't quite as emotional as the previous one, but I did enjoy seeing like the adjusting part and learning kind of how to connect with people again and figuring out how to make friends. And I enjoyed seeing some of the cast that we've seen before. And it's honestly really hard to say much more without spoiling it. So I'll just leave it at that. And I can just mention that I have the 10th book, which is the newest book, came out I want to say earlier this year. I don't know if more novellas are planned or if this is the last one. It's the last one for now. And I have it on hold in my Libby app, so I'm just waiting for it to become available. And as soon as it is, I'll listen to it quite quickly. They're like 5 to 6 hours long, and I listen at double speed. So very quick reads. And then I'll be all caught up with the series again. So that will be nice. And then the last book I read was a nonfiction book, which I am trying to read more nonfiction. And I do find it sometimes easier on audiobook because I can do other things and I don't necessarily get as ADHD distracted as I would reading a nonfiction book physically, because it can be quite hard to remain focused on a nonfiction book for me. Ironic, given that I'm a PhD student and I read plenty of nonfiction in my day-to-day life. That might also be a part of why I sometimes find it hard to focus on it in my free time. And the book that I read has a very long title. I'm just going to say the first part, which is The Return of Wolves by Eli Frankovich. And this, as the title implies, is about the return of wolves, specifically to Washington State. And it explores kind of the different sides and opinions involved, the rural community, how they feel about it, the urban community, how they see it, and goes into also some research on wolves throughout the years. Wolves are a very disputed topic, I feel, especially when they return to areas where they were previously made extinct by humans, but they would naturally be there if it wasn't for us. And we have some people very against it and some people very for it. So I found it was quite interesting. I didn't give this a rating. I feel like it's hard to rate nonfiction books, so unless I have very strong opinions about it, I don't. Now, I was interested in this book for several reasons. One of them being that Denmark is kind of in a similar situation as Washington State, in the way that wolves were returned to the Danish nature in one part of the country. It hasn't been that many years since they returned to the Danish wild, and it has been very disputed since. People have strong opinions either way. Now, I'm quite biased on the topic. I have like a lot of fascination and love for wolves, and at the same time I also don't live in the area of Denmark where there are wolves now, which means of course that my opinion might be very different from someone who does live in the area. For that reason, I found it quite interesting that this book explored both sides and interviewed people on both sides of the fence, and it was quite interesting to hear like the debate points from each side, and seemed very well researched to me as well, which is always positive. I did sometimes feel like it just like lost the thread and jumped on a tangent that I didn't necessarily see the point of. And there was also more description of people and like their backstory and their life, which sometimes seemed a bit unnecessary to me, but it might increase other people's enjoyment of it. So it wasn't something that meant I didn't enjoy the book. I still enjoyed it quite a lot and I found it very interesting. There were just some parts that I didn't feel like increased my enjoyment either. But that concludes all of the books that I read last month. I had quite a good reading month, I think, so I am more than satisfied. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of these books or if you're interested in reading any of these books. Either way, thank you so much for staying till the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time. Bye!